Hello and welcome to Journey Through Sci-Fi. My name is James.
My name is Matt.
And this episode is our Star Trek special in our space series. So Matt has very kindly sorted out the episodes for this week. So he's given me a long list of, well, I wouldn't say a long list. He's given me 5 episodes to look at as homework for today's episode. And I'm very excited to chat about these. It felt very nostalgic, as it always does in these episodes, going back to Star Trek and sort of revisiting all these old characters. And yeah, I'm excited to have a chat about warp drives and wormholes in today's episode.
Yeah, nostalgia's the word. I was really enjoying this, as I always do when we look back at Star Trek. A special shout out and thanks to my other friend James and my friend Liam, who helped me compile this list. They've both recently done a big rewatch of these shows, so I tapped into their knowledge to get some good episodes. And I really needed that help. And I think we'll talk about that in a bit, that it was quite hard to find episodes that fitted this theme nicely, and it was interesting what it showed about Star Trek in general. So should we get started?
Yeah, let's go.
Warp 1.5, sir.
Engage.
All right. Here we go.
So, the first episode you gave me as homework then, Matt, was called Where No One Has Gone Before, and it was part of the Next Generation series, and it was Series 1, Episode 5. So, let's talk a little bit about this one then. So, the main focus is about warp drives, isn't it?
Yeah, so warp drives are the main tool of travel in the Star Trek universe, and there's a lot of show-created mythology, a lot of fan lore driving the warp drives, and there's a lot to know about them if you are so inclined to Google that and get stuck into it. I think with the Next Generation, that's when the Star Trek franchise really started to lock down some of the science behind what they were talking about and some of the consistency, you know, where I don't want to be unfair to the original series. I think they had a bit more freedom to just wing it and throw some stuff together for a crazy sci-fi story. I get the sense that in the Next Generation, there was someone holding a book of rules about how the warp drive should work and how fast the various speeds were. So I think this is the first time in Next Generation they go over warp 10. I think they did it a few times in the original series because they just have a bit of fun with it. But we're starting to get the sense of the limitations of the warp drive. I don't want to get into how the warp drive actually works because I have no idea, but there is some science behind that. But the important thing is that all warp speeds are faster than light travel, and they are magnitudes of faster than light travel up to a limited point that they can't break, which is warp 10. But of course, there's loads of episodes where they do break warp 10 because it's fun to do that and it allows the characters out of their comfort zone, and this is an example of that.
Yeah, so in this episode, they're traveling past warp's end. I think that's how they put it in the episode. And the main sort of crux of what's going on is there's a couple of warp drive engineers come on to the Enterprise and are having a fiddle around with the warp drive, trying new stuff out. They're doing some sort of upgrade or something, aren't they?
Yeah, and they're sanctioned by Starfleet. They've been sent by Starfleet to come and do these repairs, but straight off the bat, within the first minute, Riker and Picard are having a conversation about that, and Riker's like, well, I think this guy's full of shit, basically. I don't want him on board our ship. So Picard gives Riker full authority to follow this guy around and hassle him, basically, and try and uncover if he's a fraud, which he is.
It was really weird seeing Riker without his beard. I haven't seen many episodes where he's all sort of like baby-faced, but it was a bit of a shocker when I went in.
Are you familiar with the phrase growing the beard?
No.
So if you know the phrase jumping the shark?
Yeah.
Some people use the phrase growing the beard as the opposite of jumping the shark. So jumping the shark is when a show has run its course and then it reaches a particular point where it just becomes crappy and over the top. The Next Generation took about one season to get settled in and get really, really good. And he grows his beard in season 2. So you say the show has grown its beard and it's turned into a really great show. So some of these early season 1 episodes are a bit ropey, or just they hadn't really settled on the core themes and the core roles and stuff, even down to like, it looks a bit odd looking back when, for example, Geordie's on the bridge wearing red instead of in engineering. We got a different chief engineer, and that they hadn't settled into their roles quite yet, but that all kind of settles in series 2. Interestingly, I think Cisco also grows a beard, but I think he does it a bit later in DS9. And in my opinion, DS9's excellent from the get-go, but there is this theme of male characters growing a beard and the show getting better.
That's brilliant. I'm going to watch out for that in future series that I watch now. If they grow a beard after the first series, I know it's going well. So what happens in this episode then? So these guys are fiddling around with the warp drive, and they're doing some sort of experiment on it. They're trying to do these upgrades, and then things go a bit strange, don't they? They suddenly go to warp's end. So they go faster than warp 10, and they find themselves 300. It would take them 300 years to get back to where they were because they've gone so far in such a quick amount of time.
Yep, they're 3 galaxies over, I think, which is quite important. I don't know how well established this is at this point in Star Trek, but in Star Trek lore, we don't really go outside of the universe. I think one of the films deals with the original crew going up to the edge of the galaxy, and it's just not something that happens in Star Trek. We never leave the galaxy. We're going to talk about a Voyager episode later. We're going to talk about a DS9 episode later. Voyager is set in the Delta Quadrant. Deep Space Nine has access to the Gamma Quadrant. Most of Star Trek takes place in the Alpha Quadrant because that's where the Federation space is. It's where the Klingons and Vulcans and most of the other races that you know, they all live in the Alpha Quadrant. They've kind of divided the galaxy up into 4 quadrants. It's quite hard to visualize. I've seen like maps of it. It does sort of map 3D space, but it's kind of easier to look at it from a 2D top-down traditional map perspective. But you've got these quadrants and they get mapped out in quite a lot of detail over the course of all of the series, and it becomes, that's the universe of Star Trek is just within this galaxy. So going not just outside of that galaxy but 3 galaxies over is quite a big deal for the characters and what they're going through. You know, they've got a very confined view of the known universe, and it's kind of, you can see it in the way they're performing it and a little bit in the way they present it on screen. I don't know how well that came across because it's kind of ropey and 1980s-y, but you know, the way this new galaxy looked was quite interesting.
Yeah. So they've gone far further than they've ever gone before. And it turns out that the engineer that we think is the person who's behind this new upgrade for the warp drive isn't the guy who we think he is. It's actually his assistant, who it turns out is a traveler from a different dimension who has like tried this technology on the Enterprise. So that bit I found really interesting. The fact that there's this traveler who's come from a different dimension, a different sort of universe, and he's sort of traveling around, going on different spaceships and trying to give little bits of extra knowledge to this universe, the Star Trek universe. What did you think about that whole element of this episode? Because I feel like it's a big part of this one in particular.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I enjoyed that. One of the things that character said was that Riker kind of challenges him on like, well, you know, if you've been around since all of time and you can traverse time, why have you never come and spoken to any humans? And the answer he gives is like, no offense, but you guys were never that interesting until now, which is a massive burn. But it's also important for, I think early on in Next Generation, where this episode comes, it's important for kind of setting the scene that this universe is bigger than we thought, and it's trying to give some scope to the real universe and the Star Trek universe as well, and kind of placing the Federation within that. I don't know how much they really explore that in Star Trek, because we will go back to our galaxy, and for the most part, Star Trek stories stay within that. There's a whole Voyager subplot with Species 472, I think they're called. I think they're from another galaxy or another dimension, and they try and delve into that a little bit, but it's always kind of out of the comfort zone of Star Trek, I think, to go outside of the galaxy and explore that scope. But it's nice when they encounter aliens who are like, you're kind of small fry, you know, you're not a big deal.
Puts them in their place a bit.
That's also kind of what happened with the Vulcans, essentially, the first time they met them. Have you seen First Contact?
Yeah. Not for a while, though.
So that's the kind of principle of... it becomes the principle of the Prime Directive, I think, in the Federation, which is that you don't go and mess with an alien culture if they haven't developed warp drive yet, because that's them kind of being able to reach out into the universe and contact other species and travel faster than light. So when Zephram Cochrane, who developed the warp drive in Star Trek mythology, he's immediately visited by Vulcans in the film First Contact, because humanity reaches faster than light travel. You're part of the galactic civilization. You can come and hang with the big dogs now.
I love that idea as well. Sort of like they're out there and they're just waiting for us to catch up. And once we do catch up, they'll make contact, and then we'll be allowed into their club. And
we've seen that in other films, haven't we? That's kind of what happens in Contact, isn't it? The aliens are out there kind of waiting for us, and then in that film, I guess they violate the Prime Directive, don't they? Because they give a helping hand to Jodie Foster to get humans into space. That wouldn't happen the Federation wouldn't do that in Star Trek, but it's a similar idea that, like, we're waiting for you up here, and if you can figure things out, you can come and join the big civilization.
Yeah, and that strives further technological advances, because if they know that they can get to that point, it gives them something to aim to, so they just keep on developing more different technologies. And sort of the way he describes his way, the Traveller, the way he describes his science, the way that his warp drive would work and how he can cross dimensions. He says it's like you would probably view it as some sort of magic, because it's so far in advance of what you as humanity know about. So I thought that science versus magic thing was a nice thing to come back into play, because that's what we were talking about when we looked at A Trip to the Moon at the very start of the series. So again, that's sort of like space and technology. It could look like something magical if you don't understand the fundamentals of it. So it was nice seeing that come back in.
Yeah, now I think some of that magical stuff becomes a bit of a storytelling problem in Star Trek. A few of these episodes where we're dealing with pure space travel in Star Trek do tend to hit a bit of a roadblock, which I thought was really interesting. I think Star Trek tends to use the warp drive as a bit of a means to an end to, in their own words, seek out new life and new civilizations. I think the boldly going where no one has gone before is a little bit harder for them to write. In this episode, it kind of manifests itself as the crazy visions that everyone starts having. Like, Picard sees his mother serving tea in a corridor. Worf sees his pet pig from when he was a kid. Tasha Yar has this really weird vision that I don't remember any of this from season 1. Tasha Yar was raised on some terrifying colony where she's chased by rape gangs. And I that was just like a brief moment. I was like, well, what part of the Federation has rape gangs? This isn't the Federation space that I remember. I don't know what the history there was. But anyway, what did you make of all of that? I didn't get a clear sense of why they were having these crazy visions.
It reminded me of things like 2001 and Interstellar, because in both of those, the way they travel at the end, they're experiencing time in a different way. In 2001, Dave is moving through time at a different pace. He sees himself as a young man, then he's an older man, and then he's on his deathbed, and so on and so forth. And in Interstellar, he's crossing into a wormhole and he's experiencing time again in a different way. He's seeing sort of different moments in his past, and he interacts with them through gravity and that. And that's just a brief outline of Interstellar. But yeah, I found it interesting that this episode had those kind of elements, and this sort of linking between traveling to different points in space and traveling through time, because obviously as you travel, it takes you a certain amount of time to get somewhere. But if you can have some sort of power over the time element, then you can travel at a different pace and go from one point to another point in the blink of an eye. So I found, I think that sort of link is important in how we look at space travel in science fiction films and just culture in general.
Yeah, I think you've got the crux of it. It's to do with the melding of they're dipping their toes in the traveler's means of travel, which includes bending time and space all into one sort of continuum. And I guess that's how they visualize those effects. I think that it is similar to 2001 and Interstellar, but those are big, very visual films from auteur filmmakers who have the artistic license to really present that in an interesting visual way. And I think in a kind of episodic network TV sci-fi show, it's the same principle, but it's just not as striking and interesting when it's like a pig wearing some prosthetics, to represent that, as opposed to, the mind-bending visuals of warping through space in 2001.
Yeah, definitely. It's interesting seeing it on sort of like a different level in this particular episode. So the Traveller, like we said, is from a parallel universe. Did you see about that news report recently, which, as far as I know, is rubbish now? But NASA claimed that there'd been something in a bunch of tabloids that NASA had found evidence of a parallel universe. Had you seen anything about that?
I'd seen that. I was a bit skeptical of it because, as you say, it was mostly reported in tabloid newspapers. And I think that if there was to be evidence of, definitive evidence of a parallel universe, we wouldn't read about it in like the Mail.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it would have a more robust evidence source for that. I think it was, so what was it? They just found some readings of some neutrons or protons or something that were a bit mysterious, and there were a few hypotheses floating around, and one of them included something about interdimensional particular travel.
Yeah, it's something to do with experiments they were doing in Antarctica, isn't it? But it's interesting that all of this parallel universe idea is coming to the forefront a lot more. When we talked about devs, we mentioned about that kind of thing. If you haven't listened to those episodes yet, listen to those and you'll understand what we're talking about. And also things like Spider-Man Into the Multiverse. There's more evidence of this becoming more of a theme in science fiction. So it's interesting seeing that here in a show which is from a while ago now.
Yeah, and they will certainly mine that rich vein of sci-fi thought in Star Trek. They do that more with the mirror universe, and I think if we do a series on alternate dimensions or something like that later down the line, we can definitely dip into some mirror universe stuff in Star Trek to have a look at that.
That sounds very intriguing. I'll be up for that.
So one other point on the Traveller. Have you seen all of Star Trek The Next Generation? Do you remember him coming back?
No. Does he come back?
Yeah, I don't want to spoil it because it happens like in the final season, and it's kind of a major return to events in the first season. So I guess we'll just put a pin in that, because the things he says about Wesley are actually they don't do a lot of serialization in The Next Generation, but they're sowing some seeds there that's going to be Wesley's arc throughout the whole show. So Wesley's like this kind of special golden child, and the Traveller's like, you need to nurture him. He's like the Mozart of space travel. I meet someone like him once in a lifetime. So the Traveller's going to come back for that reason.
That's interesting, because at the end of this episode, Wesley is promoted to ensign, isn't he? So he starts having that character arc start from this point. He becomes a proper member of the crew rather than just a civilian passenger.
Yeah, he's incredibly annoying. And they have a bit of fun with that. It is quite fun the way Picard sort of openly hates him and just doesn't want him on the bridge. But they also try to do all these heartwarming scenes like what you just mentioned, where he gets promoted. I feel like Will Wheaton was a little bit too old to be playing the character, because they do play him like a little boy, like the kid from Lost in Space,
Yeah.
But he's sort of almost a grown man. So it's just very odd. Yeah, so that comes back, but I think we'll put a pin in that because we might want to talk about that in a future episode. In the meantime, let's talk about another episode where characters deliberately break that warp barrier. Instead of it happening accidentally because of a weird alien showing up. Voyager, Season 2, Episode 15, Threshold.
He is approaching the threshold. Engine output at maximum. Velocity. Warp 10. Yes. Transwarp engines are stable. So are the nacelle pylons. I'm going to... Oh my God.
Lieutenant, can you hear me?
Captain, he just disappeared off sensors.
Have you seen this one before?
No, so this was the first time that I've seen it. So when you sent me the list of episodes, you put that this was a particularly controversial episode as well. So I'm interested to see what you say about that. I have theories.
Tell me your theories first.
Well, the one bit that I noticed was, so it's basically the main premise of this episode is they're trying to get past warp. Is it warp? They're trying to get to warp 10 or past warp 10?
Yeah, so warp 10 is the science or the kind of the rules around warp are a bit more solidified at this point in the Star Trek chronology. And warp 10 is firmly established as this unbreakable barrier where if you can get to it, it's infinite velocity. So you can be anywhere in the galaxy in the blink of an eye if you can crack this code.
So Paris does this, he breaks the threshold in one of the vessels. And when he does, he has like an outer body experience, and he's like in every moment of time at the same time or something like that. And what happens to his body afterwards is it kind of mutates, and they say he's like, later on you find out that he's basically evolving into the next stage of humanity. And part of that evolving, this is where I think the controversial bit comes in, is that he grows 2 hearts, which is very similar to another very popular science fiction character.
Oh man, I've really I feel like I've sent you way off the scent by writing controversial.
Well, that's what I thought. I was like, oh, is it because Paris basically becomes like the Doctor? He becomes the Doctor Who character because he's got 2 hearts. He's travelled to every moment of time at the same time. Has he become a Time Lord in going past the threshold? That was my theory on this episode.
Oh man, I love this. This is amazing. I'm sorry, that's not at all what I meant. And I like the way I've just seeded these insane thoughts in your head, but you know, I like where you're going with it. I
mean, I probably wouldn't have clocked any of that if I hadn't been looking at the episode. So being like, why is it controversial?
So the reason it's controversial, and the reason I wrote controversial, I think I put this on our shared spreadsheet for the podcast, and what I really meant was it's kind of I think it's going to be a controversial choice for our listeners to see this because this episode is shit. And we have such a limited ability of how many episodes we're really going to be able to talk about to record one podcast. So I was hesitant to choose this one because it's crap.
It's mad though. It's mad what happens in this episode. The end of the episode, so Paris is evolving into this weird creature, and then he takes Captain Janeway and they do another warp drive past the threshold, and then they turn into big, like, catfish-looking creatures, have sex, have offspring, and then get de-evolved back to their original forms. That was when it got completely bonkers for me.
Yeah, and not only that, they get de-evolved back to their original forms, and the crew leaves their offspring where they were. So, like, God, no, they take no responsibility for those crazy multi-evolved offspring. Yeah, it's not considered a great episode, I don't think. I think a lot of Star Trek fans would agree that it's quite bad. And that was my memory of it. And this abiding memory was the space slugs that they evolve into and how ridiculous it is. What I was quite surprised by, to give it its dues, everything up to like the last 15 minutes I thought was really, really good, actually. All the work they do into breaking the warp barrier is really interesting. I think up to a certain point, it's the best Star Trek episode about space travel itself, because they're really like, they're working as scientists and engineers as Starfleet should be to overcome this tricky problem, which is their fundamental problem of Voyager, which is that they are stranded on the opposite end of the galaxy, and they just want to get home, and they need all these creative ways to do it. Again, so what I was saying before about, like, I think that space travel writing, going where no one has gone before, presents this storytelling problem for Star Trek writers. That's kind of my overall thesis, I think, of this episode, is that it's a bit of a problem because it's so good, and then what do you do with it? I even quite like the concept of him evolving in this crazy way because he's escaped the bounds of time. It doesn't make a great deal of sense that one human being could go through the evolutionary process sort of unilaterally, but it makes a little bit of internal sense that he's stepped out of the bounds of time, so it's causing him to do that. It's just the kind of the space slugs and the babies, and then what do? They just sort of stick them in the warp reactor and then they get fixed. And that's like cold end. It's just like, boom, done. Everything worked out okay.
That's it. There's no real explanation to it. They just go, oh yeah, we fixed you now. There you go. And then Paris and Janeway have this really awkward conversation about who initiated their sexual encounter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's so strange.
I mean, I quite enjoyed the episode, though, I've got to admit. Maybe it's because I had that weird theory about Paris turning into a Time Lord.
I led you on such a wild goose chase with that. I'm sorry, mate. But it gave you a really interesting take on the episode.
It did.
So again, I found it interesting that they invoke the name Zephram Cochrane in this one. They're saying that Paris is going to be like the Wright brothers and who else? One other person, Neil Armstrong probably, and also Zephram Cochrane. That's the mythology of Cochrane, is that he's up there with those kind of inventors, which is why I think First Contact works so well. James Cromwell plays him. It's a really good take on the character. He's not quite this like legendary, amazing hero. He's actually quite flawed and afraid, and he wants to give up and all of that. And the characters have to like talk him through it. I do like it when we get references to him in Star Trek and we kind of come back to that legacy.
Yeah, and it's interesting, this sort of like this idea that there's going to be, so that even in Star Trek, they're looking for the next big inventor to create this next form of space travel. In all of the films we've been looking at, there's always been someone trying to get to that next stage in space travel. We've seen sort of like how it affects people. We've seen sort of like how far people come. Sometimes it's messages from aliens that have given us the extra knowledge in order to travel into space. And we've also seen a lot of stuff about the effects of space travel on people. And I think the next episode, which you brought up, has the fundamentals of that. So the next episode is another one from Voyager. It's Series 5, Episode 1. It's Night.
It's the captain. As you may have noticed, she's isolated herself from the crew.
She believes that she made an error in judgment 4 years ago, that she's responsible for stranding Voyager in the Delta Quadrant.
She told you?
No. I've been observing her behavior for the past 4 years. Guilt has been her constant companion.
So Night, I really enjoyed this episode because everyone is freaking out, basically, aren't they? They're all having an existential crisis, to stay on topic from the last space episode. And so they're stuck in a part of space where they can't see any stars, and it's having a real negative impact on the crew, isn't it?
Yeah, they all completely lose their minds. I think Neelix is actually the best at that. Surprisingly, Neelix, not everyone's favorite character, but he's got this actual formal role on the ship now. He's the morale officer, and he is totally losing his mind over everything. He's like actually having a nervous breakdown. There's an amazing scene where he goes to the doctor for treatment for this, and it's another great Doctor moment, which we didn't actually get a great Doctor moment in Threshold because it's still quite early on in Voyager. This is season 5 when Robert Picardo is just absolutely clearly loving what he's doing. And he gives him this speech that he thinks that this time that the crew's spending in the void is like, well, I completely understand what it's like because this is what it's like when my program's disabled. I just go into a void and it's horrible. And Neelix is just like, you're not helping, man. That's really freaking me out even more. I love the idea that the Doctor's just been going through that his entire existence, living in this terrifying existential void.
Yeah, that was brilliant. And the fact he's sort of like, he's a bit blasé about it. So he's kind of like, you guys are having a tough time now, but I've been having an even tougher time.
Yeah, it's a great little Doctor moment, as we've seen when we looked at the AI episodes where we focused on him. It's just classic Robert Picardo. He's great fun. So who else is having like a good breakdown in space?
Well, I quite enjoyed seeing what Paris was getting up to. So he's just basically spending his time pretty much playing computer games on the holodeck. He is in this weird role-playing game where he's kind of a Flash Gordon character. Isn't he Captain Proton or something, I think they call him?
Yeah, that's a recurring thing on Voyager. That's like him and Harry Kim's favourite thing to do is go into the Captain Proton hologram program, which I think is supposed to be... He actually mentions in this episode, I think, that it's a 20th century depiction of their present day. So it is literally supposed to be a fictional like recreation of Flash Gordon, basically. I think early on I thought it was... well, because it's a holodeck program, I thought it was like, oh, is this supposed... Were early holodeck programs in black and white? Like, why would it be like this? But no, it's like a deliberately... retroactively retro trendy program based on stuff like Flash Gordon.
Yeah, because it really looks like that as well. There's, especially in the first scene of this episode, there's a character who looks exactly like Emperor Ming.
Yeah, it's good fun. They go into that a lot. And of course the holodeck becomes incredibly important to the crew as they're in this void because, and it very much like Aniara, right? They are suddenly aware of the emptiness around them and the infinite blackness of space. They really want to go into the holodeck, and people start to get a bit snippy with each other, don't they? And they want to like make sure they're getting their allotted time in the holodeck so they can escape all of that.
And they talk about opening another holodeck, don't they, in order to sort of like deal with this increased need for escape. But this is all because they're in a part of space where they can't see stars, and these are like, this crew are used to being out in space. That's all they do, pretty much. They're just floating around, going from planet to planet. But the idea of it being even worse when you can't see where you're going next and how that affects them all is quite powerful in this episode. You've got Tuvok, who meditates usually in front of like a window of all these stars. And does he have like, is he have a projection of stars or something?
He goes into they've got a cartography room for mapping the stars and trying to chart the best course home. They go into that quite a lot in Voyager. So he starts using the cartography room for his meditation because he can't just look out of his own window. So he's got to like fill that gap a little bit with some, I think it is like a projection, like you said.
But the person who seems to be like hit the hardest during this moment on the Voyager is Captain Janeway, isn't it?
Yeah, she throws a big sulk and spends most of the episode in her quarters refusing to talk to anyone.
In the dark. She just sat there, just completely cut off from everyone. I mean, this whole episode really reminded me of Lockdown, I've got to be honest, because everyone's trying to think of different things to keep themselves occupied. Because they've literally got nothing else they can do. There's not any planets they can go and visit. There's not any missions they can go on. They're just drifting through this void in space to get to the end of it so they can get closer to home. And they're all having different responses. So Ensign Kim is playing like the clarinet or something on the bridge.
I love that.
Yeah, they're like moments like that. So people are picking up different hobbies. They're doing things they normally wouldn't do, all to just get through this moment in time where they can't go anywhere or do anything.
Yeah, it was like Lockdown, wasn't it? Yeah. So again, to come back to my point about Star Trek really struggling to do these things, this and Threshold are good examples where they do something really interesting with space travel and the nature of being in space, but they can only sustain it for about half of the episode. This episode's really bleak for the first half. And Janeway even has a really interesting line because Chakotay has to go into her quarters and basically say, you got to come and talk to the troops. Like, you're the captain and you're sulking in your room. Like, you got to get a hold of yourself. But she turns to him and she like reflects on the nature of being stuck on the other side of the galaxy and how hard it is. And that she'd never really had a moment to stop and think about how hard it is. And she's regretting her decisions. And it's great. You don't often get this kind of introspection from characters like Janeway. And she even says, like, I'm longing for some random battle with some aliens because it's easier. It's basically familiar ground for me because I don't want to have this existential thoughts. And I loved that. And then I was so disappointed when the episode then actually does give them some big alien battles, because it was like in the dialogue, in the writing, you'd already said that this was a big moment for the character to not have an alien battle to fall back on. And then they do just give her an alien battle to fall back on. I was really, really quite disappointed with that.
Yeah, I think it's difficult with this particular episode because it is the start of Series 5, isn't it? So I think people coming back to the series want some of that alien battle element in the episode. So I think they had to have that alien battle, because if they didn't, then people coming back into the series would be like, oh, this is a really boring episode. This is just the characters going through shit. But that's what I liked about the episode. I liked all of that introspection. All of those elements sort of brought more out in the characters to me, and sort of like, what are they doing now? How are they going to get through this moment?
Yeah, I think that's a really good observation. I'm always really interested in the tension between production companies and studios and networks, and versus the kind of creatives and artists who are writing and directing and acting. And I think that's a really good observation. Yeah, you couldn't start a season like this, but what a bold move it would have been to start your 5th season with this incredibly bleak, introspective, existential episode where we're just dealing with how the characters are feeling after 4 years stranded in space. It really would have been such an incredible move for them to make. And in my personal opinion, it kind of demonstrates the way Voyager didn't take big risks like that in its storytelling, and why I find it such a disappointing show, having enjoyed Deep Space Nine so much, which I think really does take some big risks in its storytelling outside of the Star Trek mold.
Definitely. I think, yeah, you're right. You're right with that, because I remember when Voyager came out, I'd watched quite a bit of Deep Space Nine beforehand, and it didn't quite have the same tone, and I think it lacked a bit in that.
Yeah, I think Deep Space Nine wasn't afraid to go into some really dark places with its characters, whereas I think this episode of Voyager is a good example of them backing down on going into the darkest places with their characters and not being willing to really explore that mindset that Janeway gets herself into.
Instead, what happens is there's a big power cut, they're in literal darkness, and then there's an alien, and then there's a whole thing about them helping that alien and going against these weird other aliens who are just dumping like toxic waste into their space. And it all gets a bit crazy. And then they drop a wormhole in there as well, don't they?
Do they? Oh yeah, there's a vortex that he's using to dump that like industrial space waste. I really lost interest. You mentioned the blackout. I was like on tenterhooks because it was such a good way to ramp things up. It was like, oh, on top of everything they're going through, they lose power on the ship, so it's dark inside the ship as well. Again, how bold would it be to tell the rest of your story that way and turn off the lights inside the ship for like 10 minutes of the episode? And then as soon as the aliens showed up, I was like, oh man, it's just going to be like a fight some aliens episode. I was gutted.
And then everyone sort of came back to their old selves by the end of it. And that's kind of how it ended, really, isn't it?
Yeah, I understand the need to do that. They always kind of need to do that on these shows that are more episodic. But let's talk about a show that was less episodic and, like I said, unafraid to go to those dark depths, because we didn't talk about this when we did our last Star Trek episode. It's my favourite Star Trek, Deep Space Nine. We watched episodes 1 and 2 as a movie, the pilot episodes, Emissary parts 1 and 2.
It is the unknown that defines our existence. We are constantly searching, not just for answers to our questions, but for new questions. We are explorers. We explore our lives day by day. And we explore the galaxy, trying to expand the boundaries of our knowledge. And that is why I am here.
So first off, Matt, I was very, very happy when you put these 2 episodes in the homework for today's podcast. So I haven't watched Deep Space Nine since I was a kid. So coming back and then watching the first 2 episodes, I was remembering so much about it. And I don't think I really appreciated how much I'd actually watched when I was younger, because I think out of all of the Star Trek series, this was the one I kept coming back to when I was younger, because I think the stories are so interesting and engaging in Deep Space Nine. And it's surprising because it's set on a stationary space station. They're not traveling to distant planets and things like that. Yet so much happens with the characters, and you get a real sense of everyone on this space station that it keeps it constantly interesting. And I mean, each of the characters, their intros are brilliant. You get a complete sense of who everybody is in that first episode. And it's just great.
I'm so glad to hear you say that. I watched it all when I was a kid and I loved it. I rewatched it all in university and I was like, wow, this is even better than I remembered. And just watching the pilot episode now for this, I was like, okay, I think I gotta let this run on Netflix, and I think I'm gonna watch even more of it. But you're right, it's such a good pilot episode, and you've hit the nail on the head with the kind of fundamental problem with Deep Space Nine, which is that it's on a station, it's not on a spaceship. And like I said before, the spaceships give the writers the opportunity to just have them randomly approach an alien world, and we can have a whole 45 minutes just having a look around this alien world, and we'll tell a great story with it. DS9 cannot do that. They do have a few exploration episodes, they'll take a runabout out, but we're kind of stuck in one place, and it presents a problem. And I think it's why some people don't like DS9. I know it's a little bit polarizing with some Star Trek fans. I absolutely love it, but the things that I love about it are what make it so different from the Next Generation and the original series. And I think some people dislike it because it's so different from what's gone before.
Like, I had a proper nostalgic flashback when I was watching it, like the moment in the intro where there's like a meteor, an asteroid just rolling through space.
The very first shot of the opening credits, yeah.
So it's like I saw that and I was like, oh, I've seen this so many times, but it's been in the back of my head for so long. And when I was seeing the different ships and stuff, I remembered I had key rings of the DS9 and one of the Cardassian ships as well. And yeah, so I just remembered all of this, so it made it even more of an experience for me coming back to it.
Yeah, I had I don't think they were micro machines, but they were sort of that size and that detail, really detailed little models of the station. I had a runabout. I had one of those Cardassian ships that we see in these episodes. I think I had a couple of others. I just absolutely love them. These tiny detailed models. Yeah, I got so much nostalgia over me watching these. When the trumpets come in on the opening sequence as well. Ba, 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 ba.
So let's talk a little bit about what happens in these first 2 episodes then. So it's really setting the scene. It's going through how they're repairing this station, which is quite kind of, it's very run down, isn't it? There's they're really starting from scratch.
Yeah, it's an absolute dump, specifically because it's not even a Federation. So it's not a starship, it's a station, but it's not even a Federation station. It's actually Cardassian made, and the Federation characters are kind of inheriting it as they help facilitate Bajor's reconstruction as a planet after 60 years of occupation. So the human characters in the Federation are kind of entering an existing scenario, and there's less exploration in that setup. And as the Cardassians left, they've basically trashed the place because they're not very happy about having to leave Bajor, and they hate the Federation. And that's going to become a recurring thing. It's just the Cardassians just coming along and making life difficult for our heroes as best they can without ever breaking any international laws, just being dicks, basically, and causing a lot of trouble. So the reason I put these episodes on was I was really focused on the wormhole. I wanted like a good DS9 wormhole episode, and eventually I just settled on, well, let's just look at the introduction of the wormhole, because that's the main interesting means of travel. We're not going to be doing interesting stuff with our warp drives in Deep Space Nine because we've got wormhole, and we can explore the Gamma Quadrant through that, which is not seen in any other Star Trek series. That was my main reason for queuing them up. But what I was surprised by was how interesting that the problems of the station as a storytelling device, how that's all set up in the first half of this pilot episode, even down to there is a scene where they just want to move the station closer to the wormhole, and Chief O'Brien's got to sort it out, and they can't even do that. It's like a few 100 miles, and he's like, oh, it's going to take like 2 months. We've just got these basic thrusters. It's really focusing on how stationary the thing is, and it's not capable of, warp speed, and we're not going to be doing that stuff that you're used to in the Next Generation. It's quite jarring, isn't it, I guess, if you're a new viewer to this off the back of Next Generation?
Yeah, because you're used to them being able to sort of fly about and go to these different places, and then now suddenly they can't go anywhere. The only place they can go is the planet down below, which they do a bit in the first episode, which was a quite nice juxtaposition between that and the space station, especially at that point when the space station is so run down. Because in a lot of the space films and stuff we've watched, you see the deterioration of spaceships and things like that. So when we looked at Solaris, it looked really run down by the end of it. It had been it had all gone to pot. And in High Life as well, it gets to a point where they're having to repurpose stuff to get it to work. Whereas they're doing the complete opposite in these first 2 episodes of Deep Space Nine. They're taking something which is badly damaged and worn down, but they're making it into something great. I mean, by the end of it, there's people everywhere around the space station, and you know what the setting's going to be like.
Yeah, I think that what you just said about that, you know what the setting's like is really important. This pilot does such a good job of setting that up. It's actually really important to balance against the lack of regular travel that's going to happen. It's almost like in setting this scene, the writers have created a problem for themselves, which is that we can't go to new worlds to tell a story, but that problem is obviously very deliberate and it's very well executed, and it's set up in a way that it's not a problem because we have all these interesting characters. The fact that the Federation are kind of entering into an existing situation means that there's all the pre-existing relationships, Kira and Odo. There's going to be a romance plot there later, but at first you kind of know that they've worked together, and he runs security and she's a Bajoran freedom fighter. The relationship between Quark and Odo is amazing throughout DS9. It's a constant, Tom and Jerry situation, right? Where they're kind of, Odo's constantly trying to catch Quark out, and he's always getting away with crimes and stuff. That's all pre-existing, and you get it set up in this pilot. And then at a macro level, you've got the bigger plot, which is the Bajoran civilization trying to rebuild itself after occupation. There's so much to explore there that we don't need to go and visit many other planets to fill out time. So, and it was the first Star Trek to do that. There was very little serialization in Next Generation. You got a bit with character arcs and stuff that we just mentioned, but this was really we're telling one story about the Bajorans and later the Changelings and the Dominion and the war and all of that, and we're going to tell that over 7 seasons. And there's a lot to pack into in the first 2 episodes, but it's setting the scene for all of that in such a great, fun way that we don't need to do much traveling to get that entertainment.
And I think that's what I like in TV shows, when it rewards the amount of time you put in, because you find out more about these characters and what's going on in their worlds, and you become invested in them in a different way. Because obviously you get invested in the other characters in the other Star Trek series, but with this, because of the overarching plots and storylines, you really feel like you have to watch that next episode because you want to find out what's happening afterwards. Whereas in the other ones, they're so episodic, you can sort of dip in and out. But I love that with this, you feel like you have to be watching all of it.
Yeah, they don't have that monster of the week format that the original series and Next Generation had, where unless it was a 2-part episode, you could be pretty confident that the Enterprise is going to rock up to a new planet and do some stuff there, and you can just enjoy it. And if you didn't see it last week, you're going to have a good time. DS9's still got like the wormholes there is a bit of a fallback for that. So if we need to like pop through the wormhole and see what's going on a planet on the other side of it for an episode, we can do that. And I think they probably rely on that maybe in the earlier seasons a bit more, because as it builds up, the stuff that they're seeing in the Gamma Quadrant is actually sowing the seeds for the Dominion plot that's going to really flesh out that world even more in later seasons.
Because they're already dropping hints, aren't they? Because the way that Odo talks about his past, he says, I'm an orphan and I don't know where I came from. There's nobody else like me that anyone knows of, at least around here. So they're sort of dropping that seed that he will find out about the other changelings. And that was a really interesting thing. I didn't realise that they dropped that in so early. But it's such a fundamental to how things develop in the show. Yeah,
an awful lot was plotted out early on, and you can see the seeds of it in this first episode. It's a great pilot. It's just an absolutely brilliant pilot to a 7-season show. So what did you think of the wormhole itself in terms of space travel? We've looked at wormholes before this series. What wormholes have we had? Contact? Have we had any others?
So I think the closest comparison is Interstellar, isn't it? Because they're having that moment. Well, kind of like Contact as well, because Contact, when Jodie Foster goes through that wormhole, she has an experience a little bit similar to what happens in this episode of Deep Space Nine. She is visited by someone from her past, her dad. So in this one, Sisko is visited by different visions of his past, and one of those is his wife, Jennifer, who's a very big character, and we've seen her die in the first episode, so you know how important she was in his life. So it's interesting seeing that come back into play so quickly.
Yeah, and that comparison to Contact as well, the way they both present wormholes as this kind of hard to conceptualize different kind of space that you go into and the rules just don't apply, and you can have all these crazy visions because it's this alternate space and we don't know what it's like, which I think is probably broadly supported by some physics, in that wormholes are very mystifying, aren't they? We don't know a great deal about them. They're purely theoretical, I think, right?
Yeah.
We assume they exist because of certain rules of the universe, but beyond that, we can't know much more about wormholes.
I was really fascinated with the way that Sisko communicates with this alien species that lives inside the wormhole, because he's basically having to describe a linear existence and how that works. And the way he puts it, I just found it it was very clear and concise. And I mean, he's given an impossible task in doing that. He's talking to a race which have no idea of what time is. They have no idea of loss or any of the fundamentals to human life. But he's having to put it all into words that they can understand, just using his sort of his thoughts and memories to help guide them and give them an idea and show that he's not a threat. And it's just very well done, isn't it?
Yeah, it's very good. I like that idea that inside the wormhole, because the type of space that exists in there is so different, then the rules of time don't even apply either. It's completely, it's an alien landscape of a different kind that hasn't really been explored much in Star Trek, although it is quite similar to what we were talking about earlier with the Traveller, isn't it? Experiencing time and space in this completely different way.
Yeah, so it seems like a lot of the space travel elements we've been talking about are so linked to time, it becomes even more important, doesn't it? Because I think there is a link between all of these space films we've been talking about and time travel, which I think will be interesting when we sort of no doubt go into that in more depth in a future series.
And on that note, we will be moving on to a new series of Journey Through Sci-Fi soon. We've got one more episode lined up. We're going to do our season-ending awards show to cover our favourite space films.
We've got a few little awards lined up for some of these films. So, yeah, that should be another great episode.
So please join us next time for that. In the meantime, please do leave us a review. It's incredibly helpful. You can get in touch with us if you'd like to. You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. If you just search Journey Through Sci-Fi, you will find us. You can drop us an email, journeythroughsci-fi@gmail.com. Do get in touch.
We'll see you next time.